In part, he was drawn to his most useful idea by two women in his life for whom the idea was mostly useless. Now, the sound is on. For the two men in his life for whom the world was filled with sound and voice. They were his grandfather and father, and both were teachers of speech. Without men like these, who taught the deaf to speak, many would have remained in total isolation, alone and silent. Sound and silence, these were the twin ironic seeds. But the idea was singular. The idea was the telephone, and he was Alexander Graham Bell. To a later age of disposable passions, their deep and faithful devotion seems nearly as wondrous as the creations of his mind. These, one day, were new Venetian blinds installed in their home by Mrs. Alexander Graham Bell. But deep in the night, her husband conceived a new design for a propeller and could not wait until morning to test it with other more prosaic materials. Her reaction is not recorded, but she can't have been surprised. Mrs. Bell, with Mr. Bell, knew that love was often blinds, shall we say, or dishpans, welded together to make water wheels. Or for his flying experiments, finest red silk sent soaring as a kite. Mr. Bell was like that. He couldn't help himself, she knew, and she knew she couldn't help him enough. Her love was total, as was his for her. The Alexander Graham Bell Museum, and we'll come back to it, is located in the small Canadian village of Baddeck, on the island of Cape Breton in the north part of Nova Scotia, on a rise of hill that overlooks the inland sea called Lake Bras-d'Or. It's an odd sight at first. The pure and placid waters and the timeless hills of crowding forest seem unlikely hosts for modern technology. This pleasing geometric space is filled with the objects of his ideas and the images of the people and events in his full and fertile life. For history has headlines, Bell was an inventor, and his fame attaches forever to the telephone. But for the smaller print in a man's life, Bell is seen to have a protean and prolific mind. His work embraced fundamental discoveries and innovations in speech and hearing, electricity, medicine, recorded sound, sonar, eugenics, aeronautics, engineering, and marine design. But with it all, Bell, as scientist and scholar, remained a kind of poet visionary. His genius was always gentled by a warm and giving heart. A great inventor, but an even greater man. But then the reason's plain. Over there, across the bay, in the beautiful, broad-shouldered shape of a house called Ben Vria. Ben Vria. Bell built the place and gave it its name. The words are Gaelic. Bell was a Scotsman, and we'll come to that. Ben Vria, it means beautiful mountain. Bell first came here in 1885 and continued on for every summer and parts of all the seasons for 37 years. And often they came by boat in those early days. Here he once owned 600 acres, built a laboratory, and brought forth much of his prodigious work. The house was fitted to the man, large, dignified, Victorian proper. Ben Vria is Alexander Graham Bell in the rich fullness of his life. We will enter them both. But the beginning lies east behind the hill, 38 years and 3,000 miles away, across time and the Atlantic. In Edinburgh, Scotland, in a house near this one on fashionable Charlotte Square, where the family moved when he was 6, Alexander Graham Bell, on March 3rd, 1847, became the second of 3 sons born to Melville and Eliza Grace Simons Bell. Bell was named for his father's father, Alexander, a powerful man with a powerful voice, who began as a shoemaker, but went on to become an actor and sometime playwright. Then a prosperous and colorful teacher of elocution and speech, specializing in work with stammerers. The father, also named Alexander, but known by his middle name, Melville, followed in the grandfather's footsteps and rose to surpassing achievement as a professor of speech. A forceful personality and diligent scholar, endowed with superb hearing, pitch, and diction, and a magnificent voice, he eventually devised a universal alphabet of symbols that stood for every human sound in every human language. The system was called visible speech and won him honors and recognition throughout Europe and North America. This is what Bell first taught when he came to the States. Eliza, the mother, was English and nearly 10 years older than the father. She was a talented miniature painter, the only daughter in a family of Navy officers, and nearly imprisoned by early and badly impaired hearing. By the time Alec was 13, his mother was almost totally deaf. At first, his formal education was at home, next at a respected Edinburgh academy, and then at the Royal High School, from which it appears he did not graduate. He was an indifferent scholar. What he later called the turning point in his life came when his widowed grandfather, who had moved earlier to London, summoned the boy to come and live with him. Alec was 15. He squirmed when the grandfather insisted he go out dressed in Eton jacket, kid gloves, a tall silk hat, and carry a cane. But he loved the old man and came awake under his magnetic influence. When, after a year, he returned to Scotland and became a speech and music teacher, his students never knew that some of them were older than the worldly 16-year-old Bell. In the next few years, Bell attended Edinburgh and London universities, where he continued his own teaching and research into human speech and hearing. These woods, so much like them, are not in Scotland, but in Canada, where Bell and his parents came to live in 1870. This is the family home near Brantford, Ontario. One personal reason for coming to Brantford was that Alec's own health was becoming threatened. His 2 brothers had died of tuberculosis, and the bracing Canadian climate seemed necessary in order to save his life. Bell arrived in Boston in March 1871 to accept an offer his father had declined to teach visible speech at the Boston School for Deaf Mutes. Convinced that all deaf people could be taught to speak, Bell's results in teaching the deaf made his pioneering methods seem almost magical.
Put some more breath in it. Cool. Cookie.
Cookie.
All right. May I have a cookie?
May I have a cookie?
By the fall of 1873, his success gained him an appointment as a professor of speech and hearing at Boston University. We're back at Ben Bria, this time on the opposite side from the sea, the front when you approach by road. This is a living house, still the family home for Bell's descendants. It's furnished almost exactly as it was. To enter it is a journey back in time. Portly, Victorian, beautiful. The lamps are original Tiffany's. You can easily imagine the inventor, or Mrs. Bell, coming down the great staircase with its magnificent backdrop of stained glass windows. Or perhaps even together, holding hands. But our view is of the past. For Bell, the young inventor and teacher struggling in Boston in the early 70s, all this is future and unforeseeable. Immensely ambitious, Bell labored in a Salem basement outside of Boston, deep into the night, every night, on an invention which he called the harmonic telegraph, a device he hoped would transmit more than one message on a single wire at one time. Since childhood, Bell had been a gifted pianist and loved music. For a time, he considered music as a career. He had discovered that if he sang a note into a piano, the corresponding string of the note sounded back, leaving the other strings vibrating but silent. La. He reasoned from this that different pitches could be sent along telegraph lines at the same time and in both directions, instead of one way, one at a time. He was right. Eventually, the harmonic telegraph, or multiple telegraph, was a success and led him to the telephone. But the practical work was tedious, and the necessary equipment expensive. In order to finance his experiments, Bell took on private pupils in addition to his university work. Among these came Mabel Hubbard. Mabel, stricken with scarlet fever at age 5, had been deaf ever since. But she was an intelligent, educated girl who already knew how to read lips and could talk when she came to Bell to improve her voice and speech. She was 16. Bell was 26. Mabel's father was Gardner Hubbard, a wealthy lawyer and promoter and Boston blue blood, who eventually became Bell's business associate, lifelong friend, and father-in-law. Bell and Mabel Hubbard were to be married for 45 years. She became the human center of his life, strong, stable, supportive, and practical. This home, as all else in their lives, was designed around Alec, but Mabel made it work. Along with another man named Thomas Sanders, Mabel's father had become enthusiastic about Bell's harmonic telegraph idea and gave financial backing in exchange for shared ownership of any inventions. The money covered only equipment, patent applications, and an assistant. Hubbard was less enthusiastic, in fact, hostile, when Bell declared his love for Mabel. He made Bell promise to keep his feelings secret for a year, but Bell grew desperate. After only 2 months, Bell demanded release from his suffocating promise. The Hubbards relented, and he was free to court Mabel. Mabel herself had serious doubts for months, but finally told Bell she loved him more than anyone but her mother, and if that was enough, it was more than enough for Bell. Then and there, they became engaged. On Mabel's 18th birthday, November 25th, 1875, Thanksgiving Day, which ever after Bell gave extra celebration. But love has put us ahead of the telephone, and their marriage came after that. Bell, like other Boston inventors, one of these had been a young fellow named Thomas Edison, frequently worked at 109 Court Street in the shop of Charles Williams. Williams manufactured electrical and telegraph equipment. Williams assigned Bell to one of his talented young craftsmen named Thomas A. Watson and let them work together in the attic. The Court Street building was torn down in the 1920s, but this faithful reconstruction, using the original timbers and windows, is now located just off the lobby of the New England Telephone Headquarters building in Boston. Bell and Watson, since January of 1875, had been working in the attic to perfect the harmonic telegraph. And Bell, along the way, came to realize that not just pitch, but tone could be sent along the wires. In short, a telephone. But the work was agonizing and frustrating. Bell's inadequate math and electrical know-how held him back. Failure followed failure. His health faltered, and his headaches were excruciating. But here, on June 2nd, 1875, with Watson downstairs with a receiver, Bell spoke into a transmitter, and Watson heard, though only the sounds, not the words. The work had to go on, and on and on, for days and weeks and months. Bell knew others in the country, Edison and a man named Elisha Gray for sure, were at work on similar ideas, on both the new telegraph and the telephone. Hubbard, even Mabel, urged Bell to patent his ideas. Hubbard helped him get the patents, and for further protection, Bell moved his work to 2 rooms on Exeter Place. There was more devastating failure, until finally, and without hope, Bell spoke into a transmitter. Watson, 2 rooms away, was at the receiver with wires strung between. "Mr. Watson," Bell said, "come here, I want to see you." Bell had accidentally spilled acid on himself, and his words were a call for help. Watson had heard, this time clearly. The telephone was born. The date was March 10th, 1876. Bell was 29, Watson 21. Here is Thomas A. Watson, years later, remembering those early days.
On the evening of March 10th, 1876, Bell sat in front of the new transmitter in the back room, which I had made into a laboratory for him on the top floor of number 5 Exeter Place, Boston, and I went down the hall to the front room to listen for the results with a telephone receiver. But as Bell was about to speak into the new instrument, a motion of his arm upset over his clothes a battery jar of acidulated water. In the excitement of the accident, Bell called out to me, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want you." The big mouthpiece picked up his call for help, and I heard every word of it through the receiver at my ear. The new transmitter was better than we had expected or had dared hope. Bell forgot the accident in his joy over the success of the test that filled the entire evening. He had brought his great invention to the point where its future was assured. And this first sentence, ever sent through the telephone, although apparently very commonplace, was really highly significant. For the telephone today renders no service more vital than in times of emergency. And the first message it ever transmitted was unquestionably an emergency call.
Sometime later, they had made this better model, and further improvements came quickly. Not until July 9, 1877, did Gardner Hubbard, Bell, Watson, and Sanders form the Bell Telephone Company. There were 5,000 shares, and Bell received 1,507. He kept 10 and gave the rest to Mabel as a wedding present. They were married 2 days later, on July 11, 1877. The evolving story of the telephone and the telephone company is fascinating, but too complex for the time we have. One point, though. Bell's claim to first invention of the telephone was challenged over the next 18 years in over 600 separate cases, and he spent thousands of hours testifying and preparing. At the end, however, it was clear. Bell was the true and legitimate father. This is the dining room at Ben Bria. All the furnishings here are original. Here, he and Mabel hosted gatherings for some of America's most prominent men. Bell was to become an admired and respected figure himself, wherever he went. He and Mabel moved from Boston to Washington, D.C., where most of the cases attacking Bell's patents were taking place. As much from Mabel's urging as from his own needs, Bell resumed his work with the deaf. He took the $10,000 award of the French government's prestigious Volta Prize for the invention of the telephone and put it into a new establishment called the Volta Laboratories, and set up the Volta Bureau, a repository for all data related to hearing, which still exists in Washington, D.C. And as one of Bell's most cherished pupils said about him, he is never quite so happy as when he has a little deaf child in his arms. The pupil here is Helen Keller. Helen's father first brought her to Washington to Bell when she was 6. He saw that she was bright and could be taught, and recommended that the father contact the Perkins Institute in Boston. This began the miraculous story of Helen Keller and her miracle worker teacher, Annie Sullivan. But that was not the end for Bell. He sustained them both emotionally and financially, and lent his name to show that the miracle of Helen's amazing breakthrough was not supernatural, but based on techniques available to others. He became a lifelong friend and mentor to them both. A table as big as this is meant for family, and Bell and Mabel were to have a fine one. They had 2 daughters, Elsie, born in London in 1878, and Marion, who came to be called Daisy, born in Washington in 1880. They both married, and eventually 10 grandchildren enlivened all the rooms at Ben Bria. One son-in-law was Gilbert Grosvenor. Bell had become the 2nd president of the National Geographic Society when Mabel's father, who had founded it, died in 1888. The society had been publishing a magazine which was failing for want of an imaginative editor. A splendid photographer, Grosvenor, after Bell persuaded him to take it over, soon initiated the Geographic's present compelling format and led the magazine with distinction for over 50 years. In 1905, Daisy married David Fairchild, a gifted botanist, explorer, writer, and lecturer. We're in the study. The books in here are mostly volumes Bell owned. Bell kept a laboratory down the hill, but the results of his work are back across the bay in the museum. Among the many Bell inventions were a telephone surgical probe to detect bullets and other metal fragments lodged in the body, which saved hundreds of lives before the discovery of X-rays. A vacuum jacket, the forerunner of the iron lung. He also made Edison's phonograph workable by introducing wax cylinders which improved its sound considerably, moving at a constant speed beneath a floating needle. There were the kites. Ever since childhood in Scotland, Bell had dreamed of human flight. Bell hit on the idea of the tetrahedral cell to keep the kites lightweight but strong and stable. The kites, though one towed by a steamer in the Bay of Badek, did carry a man aloft 168 feet, finally proved impractical. The tetrahedral cells went on to have important use in building and bridge construction. Bell and his associates made important contributions to flight. They contributed to the aileron, which provided planes with lateral stability, and the steerable tricycle undercarriage, which made land-based takeoffs and landings possible. He and Baldwin built and designed this hydrofoil boat. A later model, in 1919 on Badek Bay, set a record speed of 70.86 miles per hour when Bell was 72 years old. We're back in the study. On this lounge, Bell would often hold after-dinner discussions and think and labor far into the night. Since 1915, he had known he had diabetes. On July 30, 1922, Bell was resting upstairs when he realized he couldn't get up. He lingered for 2 more days, and then just past midnight, his pulse faded. Mabel rushed to his side. She called him by name. He opened his eyes and smiled for the last time. She clutched his hand and said, "Don't leave me." Then his fingers signaled in their private language, "No." Then he was gone. Mabel died 5 months later. They are buried here, side by side, at the top of the beautiful mountain, at the top of Benvria. Bell had dictated his own brief inscription: inventor, teacher, a citizen of the United States. Even as he lived, the intuitive Bell and Benvria seemed scientifically quaint, and the old man a kind of knickered monument to a past age of individual giants. 20th century technology had raced past him in a rush. Pernicious, complex, and corporate, visionaries were out of vogue. The new 20th century man was a nearsighted specialist who worked in teams and committees and laboratories larger than football fields. No doubt these depersonalized wizards would have soon invented the telephone. But because this son of his parents' equal inspirations of sound and silence understood as much in his heart as in his head the simple human need of people to talk to each other, to communicate, I'm glad it was Alexander Graham Bell